In 1943, behind the barbed wire of Auschwitz, a war was being fought not with guns, but with ink. Her name was Hannah Weiss, 34 years old, quiet, thin, and nearly invisible. Before the war, she had been a librarian in Krakow. She spent her days surrounded by books and her nights organizing reading clubs for children who dreamed of faraway places. When the Nazis came, those dreams ended. Her library was raided, the shelves emptied, and the books, her life's work, were dragged into the street and set on fire. She stood there, clutching her hands to her chest, watching words turn to ash. And yet, even as the pages burned, one thing did not. Her belief that words, even lies, could save lives. Weeks later, she found herself in Auschwitz, prisoner TA 2745. Her glasses were gone, her hair shaved, her skin pale from hunger. She was assigned to clerical work in the Camp S administration office, one of the few jobs that didn't end with death in the gas chamber. Her task was simple: catalogue prisoners, record belongings, file reports. The Germans loved order, and in that order Hannah found her chance. One morning, a new transport arrived, hundreds of frightened faces stumbling off cattle cars. As she wrote down the names dictated by the SS officer, she noticed something. A child's name had been spelled wrong. The officer didn't care, but Hannah did, because that mistake could mean the difference between life and death. Children were sent to the left, to the gas. Adults who could work were sent to the right. If she could change a single line, a single age, her heart raced as she looked at the ledger before her. The ink was still wet. The guard wasn't watching. With a trembling hand, she changed age 12 to age 18. She expected to be caught, beaten, shot, dragged away. But no one noticed. The girl walked to the right. And for the first time in months, Hannah felt something like power. That night, as she sat in the barracks, she stared at the smuggled scrap of paper she had hidden under her sleeve. It was blank, once part of a Nazi ledger. She took a tiny piece of charcoal and wrote the only thing that mattered. One saved. She hid the paper in the sole of her shoe. The next day, she did it again, and again. Weeks turned into months. She became the camp's silent ghost. Each morning she copied rosters, stamped papers, forged signatures. Each night she erased, altered, or fabricated little pieces of deception that shifted the odds of survival. When a transport list came in with the names of prisoners marked for reassignment, she swapped numbers. When a family was separated, she slipped letters into the system. Messages of hope written in a careful, steady hand. "We are safe. Stay strong. The war will end soon." They weren't real, but they kept people alive. The camp began to whisper about a ghost writer, a prisoner who could make the Germans see what she wanted them to see. Then one day, Hannah's quiet rebellion found its purpose. A fellow prisoner named Marek, a Polish doctor in the infirmary, approached her. He was gaunt, but his eyes still held fire. "Hannah," he whispered, glancing around, "we have an escape plan, but we need papers, IDs, travel passes, something the Germans won't question." She stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to forge official documents?" He nodded. "You work in records. You have the stamps, the ink. You can make them look real. Without them, no one gets past the gates." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she thought of that little girl, the one whose age she had changed. "All right," she said. "Bring me the names." For the next 2 weeks, she worked in silence, pretending to be just another clerk. But beneath her desk, hidden behind stacks of ledgers, she began creating a new kind of book, a book of lies that could save the truth. She copied signatures perfectly. She learned the precise weight of a Nazi rubber stamp, the pressure needed to make it bleed just slightly at the edges. She even studied the handwriting of her German supervisor. Every detail mattered. When she was done, she had created half a dozen identification papers, movement orders, and ration cards, all perfectly forged. She slipped them to Marek during a shift change. The next day, the alarm bells screamed. An escape. She froze at her desk, the pen in her hand shaking. SS guards ran past the windows, dogs barking, boots pounding. For hours the camp was chaos. Hannah waited, every second stretching like an eternity. By nightfall the roll call revealed it. 3 prisoners missing, no bodies found, no capture reported. They had made it. For a moment she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Joy. But joy was dangerous. Because the next morning, the commandant himself walked into her office. He was tall, sharp-featured, and silent. His boots clicked against the floor as he examined the ledgers. He turned one toward her. A small, barely noticeable inconsistency, a missing serial mark. "Explain this," he said quietly. Her throat went dry. Her mind raced. Then, from behind the commandant, her German supervisor stepped forward nervously. "It must be my mistake, sir," he said quickly. "I must have misfiled the original form." The commandant studied him for a long, terrifying moment, then nodded. "Do not let it happen again." He left. Hannah sat frozen, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. When she finally dared to look up, the supervisor met her eyes. He didn't speak, but he knew. And yet, he said nothing. Perhaps he too was tired of the killing. By the time the war ended in 1945, Hannah had forged over 400 documents. Some saved lives, some bought time, some gave hope to those who had none left. The truest weapon in Auschwitz had been a blank page, a pen, and the courage to write a different ending. In the spring of 1946, Germany was a country made of ashes and ghosts. The war was over, but its paperwork remained. Mountains of ledgers, forms, reports, the endless machinery of death, still ticking quietly in the dark. Erich Vogel had been a clerk, nothing more. That's what he told himself. He had worn a grey uniform, not a black one. He didn't shoot anyone. He didn't shout. He typed. He stamped. He filed. Now he sat in the ruins of an office in Munich, sorting through boxes of captured Nazi records for the Allied Control Commission. He wasn't a prisoner. He wasn't free either. He was just left behind. The room smelled of mildew and dust. Stacks of papers towered around him, requisition orders, camp rosters, death lists. Every page had a name, every name had a number, and every number told a story no one wanted to hear. He worked in silence. The only sound was the scratching of his pen and the distant echo of boots from British guards outside. Sometimes he would stop and stare at the handwriting, his own handwriting, thin, neat, efficient. He recognized the loops, the strokes. He had typed thousands of these names once, day after day, believing it was just another list. He used to think paperwork was harmless. But as he read those records now, he realized each line was a life. Each stamp was a death sentence signed without thought. Late one evening, while cataloguing a box marked Auschwitz, administrative, he found something strange. A single ledger bound in rough brown leather, slightly burnt at the edges. The cover had no title. Inside, the handwriting was unlike anything else in the archive. Small, careful, precise. It wasn't official, it wasn't typed, it was handwritten, in ink that had faded to grey. On the first page there were names, hundreds of them, but the numbers didn't match any known prisoner records. He frowned. He flipped a few pages. Some of the entries had odd notes beside them. Transferred to factory labour. Reassigned to transport. Safe. Safe? He turned another page. The dates jumped around. The camp divisions didn't exist, and on the inside cover, written in tiny script, he saw 2 words: "We endured." He sat back in his chair. It made no sense. He cross-checked one of the names with the official files. According to Auschwitz records, that person had been executed in 1943, but here, in this strange ledger, they were marked as relocated, 1944. He pulled another list, another file, another death report. The same pattern. The names in this book were people who, on paper, should have been dead. But in reality, some had survived. He felt a chill crawl down his spine. This wasn't an official Nazi record. It was something else. He turned a few more pages and noticed how the handwriting changed slightly in places, and hurried, smudged, written at night perhaps. And then near the middle, a faint note in the margin. Ink is truth. Ink is hope. Eric stared at the words for a long time. He had heard rumors during the war about prisoners altering lists, swapping papers, hiding messages in reports. But he had never believed it, not until now. The next morning, he brought the book to his British supervisor, a tired major named Collins. Collins flipped through it for a few minutes, shrugged, and said, "Keep it aside. Could be a forgery." But to Eric, it wasn't forgery. It was salvation, written in ink. He couldn't explain why, but he felt drawn to it, as if the book itself was alive, whispering through its pages. That night, after the others had gone, he stayed behind. He lit a cigarette, turned on a single desk lamp, and began to read. Not just names this time, but the small notes, the details scrawled in the margins. Mother and son reunited, changed cereal. Doctor smuggled medicine, marked as staff. Child reclassified as adult, spared. Every line was a lie, but every lie had saved someone. He turned to the last page. There, written in steady, graceful handwriting, was a name, Hannah Weiss, and beneath it a sentence: "This book belongs to those who refused to disappear." Eric sat there, staring at that name. He remembered something. A librarian from Krakow. There had been a file about her once. She was arrested in 1942 for hiding banned books. He had stamped that file himself. He could still see the ink mark in his mind. He thought she was dead. Now, holding her ledger, he realized she had never stopped fighting. While he had filled out reports in obedience, she had rewritten reality, inside the very system that tried to destroy her. For days, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He began to trace the fates of the people listed in the book. Some were indeed alive, found later in displaced persons camps. Some had emigrated to Palestine, others to America. He found a report about one woman who credited her survival to a mysterious clerk who had changed her papers. That was her. That was Hannah. Weeks passed. Eric kept working, filing, typing, pretending to be just another bureaucrat again. But at night, he copied pages from the ledger, carefully, by hand. He didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was gratitude. He just knew he couldn't let it be forgotten. One evening, as Allied investigators packed up the archive to send it to Nuremberg, he slipped the original ledger into a smaller box labeled miscellaneous, non-essential. He knew it might never be found again. But before sealing the crate, he added one final line to the book himself. His handwriting was clumsy, uneven, but sincere. "I was one of those who kept the records. I thought I was keeping order, but all I kept was silence. This ledger taught me that one lie can weigh more than 1,000 truths." He closed the book. Then, for the first time since the war began, he prayed. Not for forgiveness, but for memory, because Hannah's war had been different from his. She had fought to give life back to paper. And now her paper was giving life back to him. When the investigators came in the next morning, they found Erich gone, his desk empty, his coat missing, but on his chair lay a single torn page from the ledger. On it, in careful script, were 2 words he had copied from her handwriting. "We endured." In the spring of 1946, the war was over, but Europe was still broken. The cities were skeletons, the fields were graves, and among the ruins, the living drifted like ghosts, men and women who no longer belonged anywhere. Miriam Adler was one of them. She arrived at the displaced persons camp outside Bari, Italy, with nothing but a Red Cross blanket and a card with her name typed in crooked letters. Miriam Adler, age 24, nationality unknown. But even that name wasn't truly hers. She knew it every time someone called her by it, and the way the sound didn't quite fit, like a coat that wasn't made for her shoulders. Before the camp, she had been someone else. She just didn't know who anymore. In Auschwitz, she had survived because of a ledger, a strange blank book that appeared in the records office one morning in 1944. Her name had been written there in clean, neat handwriting. But the details were wrong. Wrong age, wrong birthplace, wrong parents. The guards didn't notice. The machines of bureaucracy never paused long enough to ask questions. And so one day, the name Miriam Adler had been assigned to her. The real Miriam, whoever she was, had vanished. And the girl who bore her name had lived. At the camp, days passed in slow repetition. The survivors waited for letters, for food, for permission to go somewhere new. Some waited for families who would never return. Miriam worked in the small infirmary, handing out bandages and aspirin. She spoke little. Mostly, she listened. She listened to the stories of others, trying to find pieces that matched hers. Places she might have been, faces she might have known. But memory was fragile, like burned paper. Every time she tried to grasp it, it crumbled in her hands. At night, when the camp went quiet, she would take out a small scrap of paper, the only thing she had saved from the camp. It was torn from the ledger, a page of names, all written in the same careful handwriting. At the top of the list, Miriam Adler. One morning, a rumor spread through the camp. A man from the Allied archives was visiting. He was cataloguing captured documents, trying to trace identities of the displaced. Miriam waited hours in line to see him. When her turn came, she handed him the page. He looked at it closely. "Where did you find this?" She hesitated. "It found me?" The man nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen stranger things in the ruins of war. "This handwriting?" he said. "It's the same as some false ledgers we found in Poland. They were forgeries, but good ones. Whoever made them saved lives." Miriam's breath caught. "Do you know who?" she asked. He shook his head. A name appeared once or twice. H. Weiss. Probably a prisoner clerk. A woman. Weiss. White. A name as blank and weightless as paper. That night, Miriam couldn't sleep. She walked out past the barbed wire fence into the olive groves that bordered the camp. The air smelled of salt and rain. Somewhere far off, the sea murmured. She thought of that woman, Hannah Weiss maybe, sitting in some office under the watchful eyes of the SS, forging names one by one, inventing lives, stealing souls from death. And she realized something. Her survival wasn't a miracle. It was a gift, a deliberate act of defiance written in ink. She was alive because someone had imagined her into being. In the weeks that followed, Miriam began to write. Not letters, but names. On scraps of paper, on cardboard, on the backs of ration slips. She wrote for those who couldn't write for themselves, for the children without parents, for the women who no longer remembered their birthplaces, for the men who had forgotten what their own names had sounded like before they were numbers. Each name she wrote was an act of faith, a declaration that these people were still someone. Sometimes she would pause, staring at a blank space before a name. She would whisper softly, "Who are you now?" And then she would write. Not what was true, but what should have been. By late summer, her papers reached the Red Cross. Dozens of refugees found families again, not always the right ones, but good enough to begin anew. The camp started to empty. People began to leave, to Palestine, to America, to the unknown. When Miriam's turn came, she packed only one thing, the torn page from the ledger. She folded it carefully, slipped it into her pocket, and looked once more at the camp. The guard at the gate checked her papers. He read the name aloud. Miriam Adler. She smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "that's me." And for the first time she believed it. Years later, in a small library in Tel Aviv, a woman named Miriam Adler would work quietly among the shelves. She would keep a single framed page above her desk, old, yellowed, with names fading into ghosts. When students asked about it, she would just smile and say, "It's a reminder that sometimes survival begins with a story." In Berlin, 1947. The city was a wound, open, blackened, and unhealed. Among its ruins, men in grey suits sifted through papers looking for the truth. Major Thomas Hale of the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps sat inside the cold shell of what had once been a courthouse. He had spent months in this building, where every room smelled of damp stone, tobacco, and history's guilt. His task was simple in theory, to find names, the names of victims, the names of perpetrators, the names of those who had simply vanished into paperwork. But what he found that morning would change everything he believed about survival, deception, and courage. The file came from a warehouse outside Krakow, a forgotten archive of ledgers, typed lists, and stamped cards recovered from a burned transport office. The cover sheet read, "Auschwitz Administrative Section, Recovered Documents." Inside were dozens of pages, all written in the same neat, deliberate handwriting. Every page had two columns, original identity and replacement identity. It looked almost like a bureaucratic ledger, except the second column wasn't German. It was invented. "Fake records," Hale muttered, flipping through the pages. Hundreds of them. But something about the handwriting made him stop. It was steady, human, compassionate even. A strange word to describe ink on paper, but that's how it felt. At the bottom of the last page there was a small signature. H. Weiss. Hale leaned back in his chair. He'd seen the name before. Months ago, a refugee woman in Italy, a librarian named Miriam Adler, had sent a torn page from a similar ledger to the Allied Records Office. She'd said it saved her life. At the time, he thought it was a fluke, a clerical error that accidentally spared her. Now he knew it wasn't an error. It was a mission. Someone inside Auschwitz had been forging new lives, one line at a time. The more he read, the more impossible it seemed. The ledger listed fake prisoner numbers, altered transports, even false death reports filed under real German signatures. It was a web of lies so perfect that it fooled the very machine of genocide it lived within. Hale stared at the pages, feeling the weight of it. This quiet rebellion that had saved hundreds without a single bullet fired. He whispered to himself, "Who were you, H. Weiss?" He spent weeks tracing the name, every surviving document, every witness testimony. At last, he found one mention, buried in a survivor's statement from 1945. There was a woman in the records office, small, dark hair, wore glasses. She used to whisper, "Ink can lie if it needs to." Hale read that line over and over. It wasn't enough to prove who she was, but it was enough to know she had existed and that she had fought her war with pen and paper. Months later, at the Nuremberg trials, Hale sat in the back of the courtroom as former SS officers recited numbers like they were counting freight. Every sentence was filled with the language of statistics, transports, registries, entries. But Hale couldn't stop thinking about the blank spaces in between. How many names had been changed? How many records had been quietly rewritten by someone who understood that the right name at the right moment could save a soul? When the defense tried to argue that they had only followed the documents, Hale stood up. "Then remember this," he said quietly. "Some of those documents lied back." The court went silent. After the trials, he carried the ledger with him back to London. He couldn't bring himself to file it away as evidence. Instead, he locked it in his desk, not as proof of crime, but as proof of humanity. On nights when the city was quiet and the rain tapped against the window, he would take it out, turn its fragile pages, and imagine her, this unseen woman who had risked everything to create ghosts that the Nazis could never catch. In his reports, he wrote only one line: subject, H. Weiss, presumed deceased, contribution unquantifiable. Years later, when he retired, Hale donated the ledger to a small memorial museum in Warsaw. The curator asked, "Is it real?" He smiled faintly. "Every name in that book lived. That's as real as it gets." Today, the ledger sits in a glass case under soft light. The ink is fading, the paper yellowed. Visitors pass by, whispering, taking photo, not realizing that each line represents a heartbeat stolen back from death. And if you look closely at the bottom of the page, under the looping signature H. Weiss, there's one faint, newer note written in English. For those who were given names so they could live. Warsaw, 1973. The museum was nearly empty that winter morning. The air smelled faintly of dust and polished wood. Snow drifted outside in slow, thoughtful flakes, the kind that seemed to fall just to be watched. A young woman stood before a glass case near the center of the Holocaust Memorial Room. Her name was Leah Weiss. She was 26 years old, a schoolteacher from Tel Aviv, visiting Poland for the first time. Inside the case lay a single book, thin, brown, and fragile. Its spine was cracked, its pages yellowed. A small card read, "Recovered ledger from Auschwitz Records Office, 1945, believed to be used in acts of prisoner resistance and identity falsification. Author, unknown. Signature, H. Weiss." Leah stared at that name for a long time. She had grown up hearing whispers about it, a distant relative, maybe, or a myth told among survivors. Her grandmother, who never liked to talk about the camps, had once said, "There was a woman who fought with ink. She was one of us." But that was all. No one ever said her name. Until now. Leah pressed her hand against the glass. For a moment she imagined she could feel the faint ridges of the handwriting beneath her fingers, lines of ink laid down in a time when each stroke could mean life or death. She read the description again and again, her breath fogging the glass. H. Weiss. She wondered what the H had stood for. Hannah, perhaps. Or maybe Helene. She wondered if they were truly related, or if fate had simply folded their names together across 30 years. Either way, Leah felt something inside her shift, as if a piece of history had just reached out and taken her hand. That night, she stayed in her small hotel room with a notebook and a single candle burning on the desk. She couldn't stop thinking about the ledger, about the quiet courage it must have taken to write lies in the heart of a death factory. She imagined the woman sitting at a desk surrounded by ledgers, pretending to record statistics while her real work hid between the lines. She imagined her pulse steady, her face calm, her mind focused on survival through subversion. And she imagined her at the end, when the guards were closing in, when the papers were being burned, clutching the ledger to her chest, whispering, "Someone will need to know." Leah began to write. Not a report, not a history, a story. She called it The Librarian of Auschwitz. Her words were simple, written the same way the ledger had been. Not for fame, not for glory, but for remembrance. She wrote about the woman's small rebellions, her forged names, her secret courage. She filled in what history had left blank. The sound of the pencil scratching in the night, the flicker of a candle in a room of shadows, the smell of ink and fear. She didn't know if every detail was true. But truth, she realized, wasn't just about facts. It was about the meaning behind them, the echo of one person's defiance. When she finished, she closed her notebook and whispered, "For you, whoever you were." Years later, that story, once a private act of remembrance, found its way into classrooms, memorials, and museums around the world. It was translated, shared, quoted. Some said it was fiction. Others said it was history. But to Leah, it didn't matter, because what she had learned that day in Warsaw wasn't about proving who H. Weiss was. It was about understanding why she mattered. On the ledger's final page, the real one, preserved under glass, there was a faint smudge of ink that no one had ever been able to decipher. Historians called it a mark of haste, a sign that the writer had been interrupted. But Leah, standing before it one last time before leaving Poland, saw something different. She saw the outline of a single word, barely visible, half erased by time and ash. A word that, when she squinted, seemed to read, hope. When she returned home, Leah placed her notebook beside her grandmother's photo on a wooden shelf. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of parchment and fire, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she imagined Hannah Weiss somewhere beyond that light, looking down and smiling, knowing that her war of ink and deception had done what no army could. It had kept hope alive. End of story. The Librarian of Auschwitz, a story of ink, courage, and the quietest war ever fought.